Okay, ladies and gentlemen, because of time, we have to deal with the essentials. And one of the very essential points that was made by Mr. Prendergast is that the Sabbath was not observed by man prior to the Old Covenant, to the covenant with Israel. The first point that needs to be made on that is what Jesus said. Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man. Now, if the Sabbath was made for man, Mr. Prendergast uses the view that he does not mean all of mankind. He would give you an answer to say that the Sabbath was made strictly for the Jews. But that statement made by Jesus must be taken in the context that the creation of man was at the beginning, and the creation of the Sabbath was at the beginning. So that when both the Sabbath and man were right at the beginning, when the first man and woman existed, it clearly shows that the Sabbath was made for all of mankind. I take you to Exodus 31 and to show to you that God's rest at creation was not simply a rest that God needed, but that it really was a rest which was intended to teach man to observe the Sabbath. Very, very important. Look at Exodus 31, which refers to the creation. Look at Exodus 31. Water? Look at Exodus 31, 17. Here's what it says. God rested. The point I'm making to you now is that the Sabbath was made for man. And I'm going to show you the peculiarity in the rest of God, which brings out that point. God rested and was refreshed. Note that. And what this means is that the Bible tells us in Isaiah 40:28, the creator of the ends of the earth neither faints nor is weary. So the idea that God would have rested and refreshed, revived, that he was able to get over that period of a kind of a human rest, when we rest. That's the kind of rest it's talking about. He rested and he was refreshed. The concept of God's resting and refreshing speaks very strongly to something that was happening. Why is it that a God who can never be weary and can never be tired would have rested at creation? And why would the Bible take make the point, considering the book of Genesis, that the book of Genesis covers some 2,500 years, that you would have to select what is most important to put in that one book, because it's covering 2,500 years. And yet this was singled out, that God rested and was refreshed. Why? The only answer you can have for that is that God was modeling for the humans that were with him. The humans that were there humans with God at the time? Of course. Because this was the seventh day, he had already made man. And God was with man. And it shows you that he would have been modeling for man that to rest and to be refreshed is an important part of observing the Sabbath. A very, very important point. If you do not come to that view, then you will not be able to harmonize these two texts. The text which says God is never weary, God is never tired, and at the same time it's saying God rested and was refreshed. You can only harmonize those texts by understanding the context of God's rest, that it was to lay down an example for man who was with him at creation. Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man. And Mr. Prendergast would turn and say, no, it was not made for man. It was made only for the Jews. But what would he do with the text in 1 Corinthians 11:9, which says that the woman was created for the man? If you were to follow Mr. Prendergast's arguments, his logic, at creation the woman was made as well. The woman was made at creation, the man was made at creation, the Sabbath was made at creation, and you're seeing the Sabbath was made for man, and you're denying that's for all mankind. But the woman was also made for man. Are they made only for Jews? And therefore, you cannot. In fact, the language of the statement made by Jesus, if you go back to the Greek text, it really reads, the Sabbath was made for the man. All the scholars that study that text comes up with that conclusion. Referring to Adam. And therefore, we know that the idea that God would have given Adam the Sabbath, it is an idea of giving it to mankind when he gives it. Your argument about the Sabbath is just for Jews and it was only given to, does not hold well. You take, for example, and let's argue this, when you get back, Mr. Prendergast. You take, for example, in the Old Testament, in Genesis 26:5, it says, Abraham kept all my laws, my statutes, and my commandments. Now I agree that nowhere in there does it say Sabbath. But nowhere in there can you say that it does not mean Sabbath. Because it does not declare what those laws, those statutes, and those commandments were. But the first point to realize is that laws, statutes, and commandments existed in Genesis. That's the first point. The second point is this. I put it to you that Exodus 16 reveals what those laws, statutes, and commandments which Abraham observed, that it included the Sabbath. Why do I say that? The covenant under which God was working with Israel in Exodus 16 was the Abrahamic covenant. The Abrahamic covenant. It was not the Sinaitic. The Sinaitic did not come yet. The Abrahamic covenant. And what you are seeing there is that when God was to take Israel out of Egypt, the scriptures tell us God remembered his covenant with Abraham. It was under the Abrahamic covenant that God delivered Israel, and it was the Abrahamic covenant with which God was relating to Israel. And Exodus 16, the very words where he says, my laws, statutes, and commandments in Genesis, the next time that terminology is used is in Exodus 16. This time, he says, see, you are not keeping my Sabbath. If you are committed to the principle of line upon line, precept upon precept, if Mr. Prendergast understands the Bible, that the first 5 books of Genesis, of the Old Testament, from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all these 5 books, that all 5 were written by one and the same author, Moses. If he understands that Jesus refers to those 5 books as one book, the book of Moses, and all over the scriptures, it is referred to as one book, you will not have a problem in understanding that the laws, statutes, and commandments referred to in Genesis 26:5 are the same laws, statutes, and commandments referred to in Exodus 16. Because the onus would have been upon the author, the single author, to make a distinction, to say that the law, statutes, and commandments we are speaking of here are not the ones that we are talking of in Genesis. But it's the same author. It's the same book. And you're talking about the Abrahamic covenant, which was the extant covenant in Genesis, in Exodus 16, when you saw that Abraham kept the laws, statutes, and commandments. So you cannot get away from with the argument that the Sabbath was not kept in Genesis. But let me show you the fallacy of the argument. The fallacy of your argument is that because the word Sabbath does not appear in a book of the Bible, then it means the Sabbath was not observed. That is the extension of your argument. Because you don't see it in Genesis, you're saying it was not observed. Well, the Sabbath does not appear out of the 39 books of the Old Testament. The Sabbath does not appear in well over 15 of them. When you go to those books, you cannot now utilize them and say, well, the Sabbath, apparently the Sabbath was not observed because it's not in the book. What you must understand is when you understand the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy together as a single book, then it means the Sabbath was kept during that period. You see, what you need to do, what is very important, is to study and to understand the scriptures, how it is arranged. You can't just go to a verse and say, I don't see it here, therefore it was not observed. You have to be able to take the scriptures holistically. Let me explain to you, my dear friend and brother, Mr. Prendergast, the purpose of the Sabbath. The purpose of the Sabbath is something that we must take into consideration. That it is not simply a day of rest. Why so many people run into problems about the keeping of the Sabbath is because the Sabbath is regarded simply as a day of rest. And therefore they say, well, it's a principle. I can rest one day or I can rest another day. Why should we observe the Sabbath? When you understand the purpose of the Sabbath, and that it is not simply a day of rest, you will come to appreciate the value of it. The book of Exodus 20, when God gave the Sabbath, he didn't speak about rest. That's not why he gave it. In the law, he doesn't speak about. What he's speaking about as a primary reason for the Sabbath is not rest. What is it? Exodus 20 verses 8 to 11 says, God says, remember the Sabbath day. Now you know, right away, that floors your point. The fact that he could be saying to them, remember, it must be something they were doing before. Now you will go to me and say, they were doing it in Exodus 16. That is why he will say, remember. But I've already dealt with Exodus 16 on the Abrahamic covenant, which means that he was continuing to uphold it. But listen to the reason why you must keep the Sabbath. It is universal. It has nothing to do with Israel. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day. You need to understand that. You take the Sabbath and you talk about Jews and Israel. You're not understanding the fundamental principle, the fundamental reason. The Sabbath, God has established as a memorial of his creation. And for us to memorialize him as the creator. How can memorializing God as creator be abolished? That is the crux of Genesis, of what Exodus 20 is all about. While he was giving it to Israel, two things. He said, remember the Sabbath day, meaning it pre-existed them. Two, is that he's saying the reason for doing it is because the Lord thy God made the heavens and the earth. Therefore, so you are to observe the Sabbath because it is it's memorializing God as creator. And you do this by resting on the Sabbath day. You see, if you do not understand the universality of the Sabbath, then you will not understand the statement Jesus made in Matthew when he said to he was speaking to his disciples, the people there, when he said to them that pray, speaking about the time of the tribulation, the Great Tribulation. Now look at this. This is the time of the Great Tribulation that he's referring to. And he's saying, pray that this will not happen at the time of winter or at the time of the Sabbath. Pray. Jesus was referring to a time beyond his resurrection, to a time when there will be of the end. You're going to tell me that it was not about the end. Read the text. Read all of it, and it shows towards the end. But even if you were to use the argument that it was only for the time when the Jews would have been in Israel, your point still falls, because that would have been a time until AD 70, which is many years after Jesus would have been ascended into heaven. Therefore, he was speaking of the future beyond his resurrection. And he would have been saying, pray that your flight from the tribulation may not be at the time of winter, which is a rough time for them, or at the time of the Sabbath, which is a time that he would not want them to break. The universality of the Sabbath is something that you must understand. You look in Isaiah 66, and you see there where God is saying that from one new moon to another, and you're going to ask me about new moon. Another time I have a discussion with you about it. Because you don't keep these things, you don't understand them. And from one Sabbath to another. All nations you're talking about, he's talking about the Sabbath is only for Jews. All nations, where do you get that? All nations shall come before me. All nations. I take you back to the book of Isaiah 56, which you referred to, and you said that it was only for strangers who were there in the economy of Israel. God developed on a point, and at the end of that text, he made the point that my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, in speaking of the context of observing the Sabbath. I think the arguments that you have raised are very deficient, and I'm being very kind in using that terminology. Very deficient in dealing with the points that I have raised. I've raised a point to show you how the relationship between Israel's covenant. You're telling me that the new covenant is not made, is made with all nations? But the Bible tells you a new covenant will I make with Israel. And it is not coming from the New Testament. It's coming from the Old Testament. What are the context? The context of Jeremiah 31:31 is that a new covenant will I make with Israel. Who was Israel? Who was he talking to? What were the circumstances? And you're telling me that this is spiritual Israel? You know, I think that the deficiency or the deflection, or some may wish to say deception, in that argument is very obvious. And I'm sure that the minds that are listening tonight will make an evaluation of that. How much time do I have? Good, very good. The literal keeping of the Sabbath in Hebrews. I asked Mr. Prendergast a question, and he has fumbled and he has not answered it. Well, I tried to pin him down, and he was so slippery over it. And I asked him to explain Hebrews 4:11, because it is critical that this be explained. And we must go back to that text, because it is a critical one, a warning. And this is a very important thing that each person here listening must bear in mind. That what Hebrews 4:11 is saying, God is using the illustration of what happened to Israel as an example to warn us not to make the same mistake. It says, let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest. That's a future rest. In the same way that Israel had the future rest in the promised land. The analogy. So he's saying that let us not make the same mistake that Israel made. And in making that, he says, so that no one will fall by following their, Israel's, example of disobedience. The word disobedience. There was something to obey. This is not just a spiritual thing. You cannot filter away the concept of obeying God and keeping the Sabbath and making it into something spiritual. That's why it is so hazy. You just think it's just spiritual. I can't see it. 5 minutes, thank you. And so, let us not make the same mistake. God also, he also made a point that when he said that to Israel, it's very important that Hebrews would have done this, God knew that there were minds, such as Mr. Pendergast's mind, that would get around this. So he placed in Hebrews that when I said it, I did it with abraded hands. So he gives you not only the instance, but he described what he did at the instance. And when I take it to the text, you would seek to deny that it was a breaking of the Sabbath. Yet the people of Israel rebelled against me in the desert. They did not follow my decrees, but rejected my laws, and utterly desecrated my Sabbath. Also with uplifted hands I swore to them. That is what he quoted in Hebrews. Also with uplifted hands I swore to them that they would not enter my rest, that I would not bring them in the land I had given them. So you're seeing the relationship between Ezekiel 20 and Hebrews 4. Because the quote in Hebrews 4 is taken from this text. And then he explains why. What is it that they did? Because they rejected my laws and did not follow my decrees and desecrated my Sabbath. That is a disobedience. That's disobedience. You tell me that, well, it's talking about laws, it's talking about decrees and so on. Remember, Hebrews, from which is referring us there, is speaking about the Sabbath. So you have to look here to understand the context of the Sabbath that is being spoken of. But you also stepped over something. And it is what is said in verse 10. It says, verse 10 says, anyone who enters God's rest, also, the word also. In other words, my brother Pentecost, you enter God's rest. So you get the rest that you're talking about. You're getting the rest in Christ. But there is something also in addition to. Rest from his own work, meaning the man's work. How can you overlook this? Rest from his own work, just as God did from his. And he will surprise you with an explanation for the way in which God rested from his work. Let's just say I'm going to Old Testament. How can you look at a clear text like this and try to explain it away, to say that it has nothing to do? This is a warning. And I say here tonight, the word of God has been spoken. You have seen it. If you harden your heart, if you blind your eyes to this, the blood is off of my shoulder. It is something that you need to look back at. At least take the humble road and go back and examine this text. These two texts, verse 10 and verse 11 of Hebrews. And don't try to use it and make the point that, well, it is just another thing, the Sabbath, that is being spoken about. 1 minute. What is being said here is, he made a point that the new covenant is with all nations. He cannot get away with it. the new covenant is made with Israel. But I show you how the nations benefit. So yes, the nations benefit from the covenant. It was a deceptive point. You were making a point as though we are not acknowledging the benefit to the nations. The point we're making is that the nations benefit because God made it to Israel, because he says Israel will be a light to the nation, and also that salvation is of the Jews. I know the 1 minute is up, so I thank you very much.